Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world tonight. We're going to discuss the secret space program and the legend of Alternative 3. Now, there has been much conjecture in the past about what is known as the secret space program, and there may be multiple secret space programs. And the very nature of space itself is open for debate and for question because we are not given a true or accurate picture of what space really is or what it really looks like. The information about the nature of space itself is heavily controlled by a very small group of people in this world. They are the holders of the gateway to this notion of space. And these secret space programs have existed in many different forms throughout the course of time here, and we could debate all day long as to what secrets these space programs hold and what the true nature of them is. But we're going to look at some interesting context here, because we're going to go back into the historical account, and we're going to look back at the Nazi programs pertaining to space studies. And we're going to look at the legend of what has come to be known as Alternative 3. And this is a very interesting case that we have here, discussing a secret space program. And is any of it true? This has been the topic of debate by many people who've researched this through the years. And I don't know. I don't have the legitimate answers to that. I don't know what the true nature of space, as we would call it, really is. But what I do know is that the people who ostensibly operate these secret space programs, or who have studied or been to or used different tools to analyze what is the true nature of space, they're not telling us the truth. It's demonstrable that all the information we get about space is either incomplete, incongruent, inconsistent, or outright false. Even the very nature of the photographs that we get of outer space and from outer space, well, those are all manipulated. And they say they do so out of necessity, that they have to be manipulated, because they collect these broad sets of data and these massive images, so they have to amalgamate them together somehow and make a composite image to get a picture of space or a picture of Earth from space. And there's all kinds of inconsistencies that we see and flaws. So what we know is that space is misdescribed to us. And what we also know is there is a public space program known as NASA, and this is just a PR front for secret space programs that have operated behind the scenes for many decades now. And of course, in the modern era, we also have some of these private companies like SpaceX who have taken up the role of NASA in the modern day and taken it behind the veil of corporate secrecy. So we have all of this stuff going on. But I think it's demonstrable that whatever the true nature of space is, there are secret programs that have been in operation for a long time, exploring what space is and hiding the true nature of space from us, whatever that may be. And maybe they don't know. Maybe they haven't really been there. Now, I hold the opinion, I do not believe that we have been beyond low Earth orbit. Essentially, the sky, folks. We haven't been outside of the atmosphere of Earth, and they tell you the atmosphere of Earth now extends as far as the moon and beyond. If you look at the more recent articles in the science magazines and the peer-reviewed journals, well, there's some type of an atmosphere extending all the way out beyond the moon. They consider this part of the Earth's atmosphere. Now, is this a type of revelation of the method? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe they're telling us some true things, and maybe they're not. Maybe it's all obfuscation, and we don't know the true nature of things. But I still am convinced we have not ever been beyond low Earth orbit. Now, I could be totally wrong about that, and a part of me hopes that I am wrong about that, because I've always been somebody that was massively interested in the space program and the exploration of outer space, of traveling to other planets, of all of these different science fiction notions that we've seen in television shows like Star Trek and things like Star Wars and all of the entertainment culture we have around us. That would be really an interesting facet of things to explore. I would most certainly love that to be true, that there were all of these other infinite vast reaches of space where planets with life on them could flourish and stuff like that, and we could explore the cosmos in this way and visit these new worlds and everything else. I would love to think of that as a reality. The fact of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, is the evidence does not support that from what we could see, and we have had many of these things misdescribed to us. And I would think by now, with public space programs having gone on now since the 1950s, that we would have more answers than we do, that we would have gone to more of these different worlds than we have. I would think that would be the case. But certainly, like I said, the evidence does not seem to support that, does it? There's always lies and obfuscation. For instance, had we actually gone to the moon in 1969 in the Apollo program, why do we not have a current presence there? That was one of the whole reasons for going in the first place, was to establish a base and a presence there, a permanent presence, to have the high ground. You see, it was a military front, the whole NASA program. They actually had plans in place a decade earlier. In 1959, Project Horizon was put in place by the Army. This is a declassified document. You could find it now. They had all of the technical details of how to get there, how to build a base and establish a base there, and everything else. In 1959, a decade prior to the alleged Apollo moon landing in 1969. So we've had all of this going on for some length of time before the public disclosure of the notion of these things. And I have my doubts about the stories of officialdom about space exploration and these kind of things. Why, if we were able to go in 1969, you're talking 55 years ago. More than that, isn't it? Or is it 50? It is. It's 55 years. 55 years ago, we allegedly went to the moon. Why do we not have an established presence there? Why have we not been back there since 1972? Well, we have to question all of this, don't we? There's no logical reason why we should not have established some type of a military presence there or a base there. And that's one of the questions we have here. Maybe we have. Maybe we have, but that's assuming that some of the things that they tell us about space are true. And I'm at the position in my life and my research career where I am highly skeptical of anything they hand us in officialdom. Highly skeptical. I don't know what the true nature of these things are. All I could do is look at some of the evidences that have been presented through the course of time and analyze that accordingly. And I do like to keep an open mind. I do like to consider some of the ideas. But the whole key to having an open mind is making sure to leave yourself open to new ideas, but also you don't want your mind to be so open that your brain falls out. And that's a juxtaposition that's hard to achieve in the modern realms of research, especially with all the fake data out there, all of the false information that has circulated through the course of time. It's getting very difficult, ladies and gentlemen, to navigate this information, this vast field of information we have, and be able to discern what is true and what is not true. It's become so convoluted now in the internet age that many of the sources, the original sources, have disappeared, or they've been manipulated. And this is the nature of the digital realm in which we are now entering, and that's why it's more important than ever that we keep analog records, we keep printed books, physical books with information in them, because all of this is beginning to disappear. Now, there was a time period not all that long ago when you were able to access a lot of really important older data on the internet, and now a lot of that has disappeared. You can't find it anymore. There were, for instance, a lot of old YouTube videos that were extremely informational that presented a lot of these different ideas and notions and different evidences supporting or backing some of the claims that have long since disappeared. I would challenge anybody, go on YouTube and look for videos of John Lear talking about UFOs and stuff like that. You'll be hard-pressed to find an awful lot anymore. But there used to be massive treasure troves of him giving interviews and speeches and stuff like this and talking openly on video about certain aspects of things he claimed to know. And a lot of the things he said, you can't find that anymore. I remember some of these because I watched them going back 15 years. And now they're gone. Can't find them on the internet. The same could be said for a lot of other researchers and a lot of other information that has been out there. You can't find it anymore. Now, especially YouTube, but I'm talking Google as well, the parent company, Alphabet Incorporated. They have domiciled off into oblivion many of the old records, videos, archives that were once easy to find. And now they've disappeared into obscurity. If you could even find them at all on an internet search browser, this information has become extremely difficult to get a hold of. It's getting harder and harder to find legitimate resources. Legitimate sources, original sources of information. It's getting harder to find some of the things that were once said and put out there in the public domain for people to find, and now they've disappeared. And this is congruent with what was known in the book Animal Farm as the barn wall. They're changing the barn wall, ladies and gentlemen. If you haven't read the book Animal Farm, I would strongly suggest you do so. Essentially, this whole notion of the barn wall is this is where the animals in the book Animal Farm, wrote down the rules that they were to live by and abide by, the laws. And over the course of time, the writing on the wall had changed, but none of them noticed because they could not remember a prior time. That is, all but one character, an old wise character. I believe he was a donkey, if I remember correctly. He remembered that the writing on the wall had changed, that the old rules used to be different. And we see this carries over into George Orwell's other work, 1984, where history was changed on the fly. That's what we're experiencing in real time in this digital age with the internet. All of these things that were once recorded on the digital wall that is the internet have now disappeared into obscurity and are no longer there and have been replaced with some other trope or agenda that they want you to believe in its stead. And that it's always been this way. And we see this in a lesser degree even in this physical material reality around us. This is called the Mandela effect, folks, where things seemingly have changed and have always been this way, just like on the barn wall in Animal Farm. That's always been the way, just like it is in 1984. We've always been at war with Oceania. The same thing. It's changed. They're using these digital tools to change the way things manifest in this world. We are so engrafted with this digital reality anymore that it's getting harder and harder to differentiate between what's true and what's false, and it's only going to get worse as time goes on. And I think some of this spills over into the real physical material world reality around us because of the nature of this pleomorphic reality we live in and the nature of thought and consciousness itself. And I think it's being affected by this digital system that is in place. Now, that's just my opinion and my viewpoint, and I certainly don't have the answers, and I reserve the right to be wrong about all of that. But it would seem to me that this is playing a factor in many of the changes in reality, and how this relates to what we're talking about here is we've had for a long time many notions of these secret space programs or a secret space program. And we're going to explore where some of these ideas come from and how they've expressed themselves in the past and how they've been explored by many researchers through the years. And we're going to look at this legend of Alternative 3, which has to do with a specific type of a secret space program and the theories surrounding it. So we're going to be reading from a book titled The SS Brotherhood of the Bell, The Nazis' Incredible Secret Technology by Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. And we're going to read into a portion of it where he discusses secret space programs, and not only secret space programs, but the Alternative 3 version of the secret space program. And this one has always fascinated me. If you're not familiar with Alternative 3 and the history behind it and the legend behind it and what exactly this is and where it comes from, well, we'll get to that here. Dr. Farrell talks about it, and I can offer a little bit of insight into it as well, because many, many, many years ago, I looked into this Alternative 3 secret space program lead and went down the rabbit trails and found it interesting, but just like everything else related to the topic, there's nothing definitive to go on except for some circumstantial evidence, and they did give some circumstantial evidence about this in various places, but the question remains, is it true? And that I can't answer with any degree of certainty, but it would seem that there are those interests in this world that would like this idea out there circulating among people, but they also like to use it as a method of debunking or defaming certain ideas, and they want people to think of it as being nonsense. And maybe there's a kernel of truth involved with some of it. Like I said, I don't know. We do have circumstantial evidence that supports some of the ideas presented, but then we also have stark admissions from people involved in the circulation of this theory that it may just have been for entertainment purposes. And is that not always how they do things? They like to present factual information in the form of fiction for the human mind to take in. Because if they were to tell you the truth outright, well, that would lead to a lot of contemplation in a lot of people. People would be appalled by the corruption and the lies and the deception and the disinformation that's been presented if they find things like this to be true. And people would be upset, and it could potentially tip the cradle of power. But we're entering a time period in our history now where those who control things in this world are pretty confident that they have it all locked up how they want it. So they don't care if information gets out to the general public anymore. And because we live in this age of deception and we live in this digital era, and it's becoming harder and harder to discern what is true and what is false here, they are confident that even if the truth leaks out, most people will disavow it and disbelieve it because it hasn't come from an official source. They haven't come out on the television and said, yes, this is true. And even if they do, some people won't believe it anyway. And that's the nature of what we're dealing with this digital system that is arising in this world. They are purposely keeping things ambiguous. They don't want people to be able to discern truth. They don't want people to be able to discern what is real and what is fake. That's all part and parcel of this beast system they're building around us, using this internet infrastructure to do so. So we have all of these notions of things. We don't know what's true, what's false, and it leaves us in this state of confusion. And when you're confused, where there is chaos, there is profit. And those who run this world will profit from it, and they will be able to steer and manipulate the human mind and the human condition in ways they want it to go when people are left in this state of confusion. And that's one of the reasons why we get stories like this, whether there's kernels of truth in them or not. This is why the whole topic of ufology has become such a catch-all for a lot of the conspiracy culture. All of these things are all interrelated in it. There's social engineering that goes on within that side of things too. Not only do you have the debunker and defamer side that always takes a look at anything related to these topics and tries to tear it apart and give it some logical explanation and therefore discredit any research into it on the other side. But on the side that supports UFO claims and ufology claims and secret space program claims, you have people who tell stories, and some of which portions of these stories can be discredited, and then you throw out the baby with the bathwater. So the true aspects of it get pushed aside and forgotten about by the bulk of the people looking at it, because they don't trust it, because portions of it have been discredited, disavowed, thrown to the wayside. And that's part of our human nature. We will often throw out the baby with the bathwater. If you find inconsistencies in what's being said, then you are less apt to believe what else is being said by the source. And we have the same problem with officialdom at this point. And what does this do? This creates confusion. This creates uncertainty. But this is also why we need to keep an open mind, and we need to try to research things for ourselves and vet things out for ourselves. because it gets harder and harder to discern what's real, what's false, what's true, especially in regards to topics like this. So, without further ado, Alternative 3. Among the many versions of secret space program hypotheses, none is more bizarre nor more famous than the Alternative 3 version. Alternative 3 was a documentary, and documentary is in quotation marks here, produced for the British science series Science Report, which aired on Anglia Television in the 1970s. Originally scheduled to air on April 1st, 1977, the broadcast was delayed and did not air until June, though in the production credits April 1st is listed as the date. The documentary was 1 hour long and makes interesting viewing. I'm going to pause for a moment. So now this is one of the claims after they put this out into the ether for people to see back in June of 1977. They claimed that this was supposed to be an April Fool's joke. Now, up until that point, this documentary series, Science Report, was a very serious series. It was something similar to what Nova is on PBS television, if you're familiar with that. It was a serious scientific documentary series. So they presented this Alternative 3 episode on there, which was originally slated, according to them, to be released April 1st, but they didn't release it until June of 1977. Now, these are important things to keep in mind, because later on, this gives them either plausible deniability, or it gives them the reasoning behind why they released something fake to the public. And maybe there were true things presented in here. And that is the dichotomy that makes something like this so tough to run at. Because there's intention here. Let's put it that way. If the credits are saying April 1st and it was supposed to be allegedly released April 1st, and they wanted to fool you, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, then the intention is embedded there. Now, that further gets reified when you figure that it wasn't released until June of 1977. Well, this becomes problematic. Because this, up until that point, was a seriously regarded science documentary series. So it was something people thought of as legitimate. And I did actually, at one point, I went back and I found the original broadcast of this episode of Science Report, and I watched it, and some of the acting they have in there is terrible. It really is, and you could tell it's acting and it's scripted, but what's being presented might have some basis of fact behind some of it. And this is what makes it interesting, but let's go ahead. We'll continue reading here. We'll tell you more about this. So, originally scheduled to air on April 1st, 1977, the broadcast was delayed and did not air until June, though in the production credits, April 1st is listed as the date. The documentary was 1 hour long and makes interesting viewing. Ostensibly, the documentary begins by investigating the so-called brain drain that was affecting Great Britain during the 1970s, as many of her top scientists and engineers left the country for more prosperous and promising positions overseas, most notably in Canada and the United States, and to a lesser extent Australia and New Zealand. Moving quickly, the documentary uncovers the cases of 3 scientists who simply were never heard from again, despite attempts of their families to contact them. Finally, one scientist died in a mysterious automobile accident, allegedly after placing a telephone call from a remote country phone booth to a journalist friend of his, to whom he had sent a computer memory tape. Gonna pause for a moment here. I don't know if you could still find this online, this documentary, Alternative 3, from Science Report from Anglia Television in Great Britain, that aired in June of 1977. It was interesting. I did watch this, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time, because in the beginning, they're talking about this notion of what they call brain drain, where many of these British scientists were experiencing a type of fatigue, and they felt like their potential was being stifled. So they traveled to other countries. They took jobs and things like that with these companies overseas in these different countries, and they disappeared, and they were unable to be contacted. So the inference is that they entered into some type of black budget projects or secret special access programs or some such thing, and began working and developing different technologies in one of these programs, and they disappeared and could not be found. Nobody knew where they went. This is how the show opens up. And it keeps you on the edge of your seat because you're wondering what's going on here with this. And we'll see as we progress where it goes from there. So the story goes that one of these scientists contacted a journalist friend of his and gave him a computer memory tape. And then he died mysteriously in an automobile accident. And this will be important as we continue. So on the tape, when it was finally decoded by the indefatigable investigative journalists of Anglia Television, was a video recording of an alleged joint Russian-American Mars landing in 1962, complete with video recording of subsurface life burrowing a furrow on the ground to the wild and thrilled cheers of the Russian and American ground control crews in the background. With missing scientists and engineers, a mysteriously dead scientist, and a computer tape of an alleged Mars landing, the journalists learn of a hidden secret joint space program being conducted by the Americans and Russians, a component of which was to persuade the best and brightest of the world's scientists to participate in the gradual and very secret colonization of the Moon and Mars. Gonna pause for a moment here. This is one of the notions of this that has fascinated so many researchers. If you begin digging, you find evidences that there may exist a joint secret space program between the Russians and the Americans, and I would also say other governments of the world involved with this. It crosses national bounds, and it speaks of this notion of a breakaway civilization, as we've discussed before in the past here. We have space programs that fall outside the jurisdiction and the watch of any national sovereignty. And that's why many of these things are hidden away in secret, behind closed doors, behind the veil of corporate secretism, corporate secrets, proprietary secrets, not disclosable through Freedom of Information Act. Corporations aren't bound by that. So if you don't have any government oversight and you don't have any rules or regulations in place for such a thing, who knows what they're doing behind the scenes? If this breakaway civilization does truly exist, and there are massive amounts of evidence to show that something of the sort does exist. And this is the interesting thing. So the claim made here was this tape, which the folks at Anglia Television were able to somehow decrypt and decode and play back, showed this alleged Mars landing. Now, last I checked, I think you could still find some version or iteration of this original video on YouTube somewhere. The Secret Mars Landing, 1962, where they discovered life and they discovered various other things, and it shows on the screen the alleged landing of the probe or the craft or whatever it was, with the atmosphere, how many bars of pressure in the atmosphere and the temperature and everything else, ostensibly on the Martian landscape. And one thing you'll notice immediately is the sky is blue in that recording. That's another thing as a little bit of a side trail here, you will notice, if you are older than about 30 years old, you may have remembered in the past, if you're as old as me, when you're looking at alleged photographs of Mars and you're just looking at information about Mars. Well, what were we taught back in school about Mars? What color was the sky on Mars? Well, it's supposedly red. And they give you myriad reasons as to why the sky on Mars is red and why the sky on Earth is blue, and oftentimes you'll get convoluted explanations as to why this is. Well, now in recent years, over the course of the past decade, maybe decade and a half, you'll notice that there's a lot more pictures of Mars and Martian landscapes and things like that where the sky is blue or a yellowish tint. And they're explaining now, well, the sky is blue at certain times of day on Mars because of how the angle of the sun is. And they give you a myriad of reasons for this, too. But it makes you question the true nature of this. Especially when you take into consideration that NASA runs simulation rovers and stuff like that, and simulation events simulating a Mars landing on places like Devon Island. And you can see this stuff. I'm sure you've all probably explored this endlessly. Many of the pictures of Mars are actually just pictures of places on Earth with a red filter over it. And this is part of the obfuscation, and this is part of why it is that we have a hard time discerning fact from fiction in all of this. So one of the interesting things is this was from the 1970s, and it's showing the blue sky on Mars. So you have to wonder, was this really filmed on Mars, or was this filmed on Earth, like many of the things we suspect are? And why all of a sudden have they shifted gears and said, oh yeah, certain times of the day on Mars the sky's blue? Well, maybe they got tired of having to put a red filter on everything. I don't know, to fake some of their photos and stuff like that. I don't know. I don't have the answers, but it certainly leads in the direction of misdirection, okay? They're deceiving us. We know this. Now, even if you go back to 1977, I think that was probably one of the reasons why they questioned the authenticity of this film, because they could see the sky was blue. And would they not question this in the 1970s, at which time they were thoroughly convinced that the sky on Mars was red? So you have to keep all of this in mind. And this is the shifting of the Overton window of what's acceptable and what's not. And maybe, just maybe, this is a Mandela effect as well. Maybe I'm misremembering. Does anybody else out there who's my age remember being taught in no uncertain terms that the sky on Mars was red? Always red. It was never blue, because there was no water on Mars, you see. And that's one of the reasons why they gave us in years past as to why the sky on Earth is blue. Well, it's because of the reflectivity of the water and how it filters out the different rays of light in that way, because of the Earth's atmosphere, because of our magnetic field and all of this. It filters out the other bands of light and reflects the blue. But they don't have that on Mars. So the sky there is red. And this is what we were taught. And maybe I'm misremembering, but I don't ever remember the sky on Mars being said to be blue back then. It was unheard of. But certainly, we have this landing video. And like I said, I think you could still find it on YouTube. It's interesting to watch. And if it is legitimate, it would be a hugely exciting thing. But like everything else, we need to question the legitimacy thereof. Now, does that mean that all of the notions that are discussed in this program, this science report program on Alternative 3, are false? Not necessarily. There might be something to it. I don't know. I don't have the answers. You have to make a lot of assumptions. That's all we're left with is assumptions. Now let's entertain the idea for a little bit and assume that what they tell us about the nature of space is true, that there are these other planets, and that perhaps we could fly there in a machine, but the distances are so vast and so great that it's extremely difficult. But let's consider that. Let's entertain that idea for a moment as we continue to explore this topic. The purpose of this colonization of Moon and Mars? The world's elite had concluded that the planet was being destroyed by humanity, and that overpopulation had passed the point of no return, and that life on Earth was doomed. 3 alternatives were discussed to save the situation. The first was to explode nuclear warheads in the atmosphere in an attempt to create a hole which would bleed off the pollution. I'm going to pause for a moment there, folks. And this wasn't largely known in 1977 by the public, but this was actually something called Operation Fishbowl. There were test programs that did this. They exploded nuclear warheads, ostensibly in the upper portion of the atmosphere, to attempt to blow a hole in what we might term the firmament, or the upper portion of the atmosphere, so that the gross pollution could bleed out into space. I don't know what exactly they expected from this, but they tested what would happen if they exploded these nuclear weapons in the upper atmosphere. That's what the whole thing was about. Then there was a whole series of secret programs that went on under the veil of this Operation Fishbowl. And you could look that up. I mean, this is all documented as fact now. So I don't know if anybody knew about this publicly in 1977. So this is one of the things that lends a little bit of credence to the circumstantial evidence here. The fact that they talked about this as being one of the alternatives to this destruction of Earth due to overpopulation. And you always find these same ideas prevalent throughout all of this conspiracy culture and this elitist culture. They think the world's overpopulated, and they think they need to do something to depopulate the world. And maybe since this time, maybe they've come up with more alternatives than just 3 of them. But let's read on here. The second alternative was to build vast underground installations in which humanity could survive when the surface became unviable. And the third, alternative 3, was to seek new planetary homes on the Moon and Mars. Gonna pause for a moment here. So alternative 2 was to build underground bases. We have a lot of underground bases, don't we? The elites of this world have their underground bunkers. Honestly, though, this doesn't seem like a feasible plan to stave off apocalypse or doom or any such thing. How is that going to help? Let's go live underground. We'll lock ourselves in a shelter for the remainder of our lives under the ground. That doesn't seem like a feasible solution to the problem of the destruction of the Earth, because, well, you're still on the Earth, or in the Earth, if you're burrowing underground. How is that going to help? Think about that. But that was their alternative 2. And then alternative 3 was to go off-world and build colonies on the Moon and Mars. The secret space program was thus a modern-day Noah's Ark, and the most heinous crimes were being perpetrated to ensure the success of Alternative 3. There, more or less, is where the documentary ends. It's where the documentary ended. Gonna pause. So the Alternative 3 documentary explored the notion, first starting off that scientists in Britain were suffering from this brain drain mentality thing where they were feeling fatigued, underappreciated, overworked, and they weren't getting anywhere. They were spinning their wheels. So some of these scientists accepted jobs working for secret programs in foreign countries, and they disappeared off the face of the earth. So this left their families questioning things, and it left the good people at Anglia Television questioning things They can't find these people. What happened to them? Well, they disappeared seemingly off the face of the earth. And that was the implication, that these people left Earth on these secret programs and went to establish colonies on the moon and Mars. And this is where the thoughts in this documentary were steered to. And then they found this other evidence of this alleged videotape of the Mars landing to reify that notion of things, that there was this secret space program that was establishing a presence on the moon and Mars, and that some of these scientists may have been involved in that. And that's where it left. So it discovered, more or less, that this secret space program exists, and it was doing some heinous things in the background to get this program off the ground. It was making people disappear who were whistleblowers. So you have all of the hallmarks of modern conspiracy culture bound up in this story. Now, like I said, are there kernels of truth to it? Perhaps. But there was also low production value with it, and you could tell a lot of the acting in it was terrible, and a lot of it was staged and for show only. And then there's also the other aspect to it. Science Report was an esteemed, credible science documentary show at the time. And this was the first and the only time that they allegedly pulled off a theatrical work of fiction like this, and the show was canceled shortly thereafter. Remember, this aired in June of 1977, and they claim the original production date for it, that it was supposed to air on, was April 1st. It was supposed to be an April Fool's joke. What kind of a serious scientific documentary series would film an April Fool's joke and perform it, especially not on April Fool's Day itself? So this, in and of itself, leads to further obfuscation here and further questioning as to the true nature of this. Was this intended to be a Trojan horse? Was it intended to be a red herring? Was it giving you some actual facts, along with a bunch of nonsense to throw you off the trail? I don't know. It is an interesting case study, though. But let's see what else Dr. Farrell has to say about this. Because as we'll see, the story doesn't end there with this documentary series either. So Dr. Farrell says, but the story did not end. In fact, the network was so flooded with calls from thousands of people who professed their belief in the whole wild scenario, and who in some cases added their own stories of encounters with the hidden masters of the project. The problem was, the whole program was a complete hoax, an elaborate April Fool's Day joke, intended as such by the producers and authors of the teleplay, David Ambrose and Christopher Miles, a fact that would have been evident from careful examination of the closing credits, with its very clearly stated date and a long list of cast which included professional actors. The story would not die, however, and was soon followed by a badly written book of the same title, about more in a moment. To one Canadian inquiring about the truth of the documentary, co-author and producer Christopher Miles stated, quote, "The idea for the film and subsequently the book was something that David Ambrose and I dreamed up over a lunch together in London, as I was getting rather tired of the docudrama on television and wanted to prove how easy it is to lead the general public up the proverbial garden path. I am sorry that you were one of them, and if you look at the film or read the book, you will realize that there are hints of its unauthenticity all the way down the line. Of course, it has a sprinkling of fact in it, but the basic show is a complete hoax, and if you think a bit more yourself, you would realize this was the case," end quote. So I'm going to pause. So here's a stark admission that it had a sprinkling of fact in it. Well, what facts was this guy talking about? So it seems to me there's something that doesn't add up to this story. This producer of docudrama series, this science report show, why would these two guys get together and decide, let's do this, just to show that we can manipulate the public? Was it a social engineering experiment? Were these guys funded from somewhere on high? Was there a research study done by some think tank group or philanthropic organization? Maybe. We've seen similar things happen in the past. Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio teleplay was one such event that was used to study the social engineering of society. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that that's all this was a test to gauge how gullible the population could be. The thing that gets questioned, though, the most is, why did this air in June of 1977 if it was intended as an April Fool's joke? And what happened to Science Report, the television show? Would these guys purposely sabotage their own careers just to pull this prank? Because that's what seems to have happened. Now, if these guys were producers and writers for the show Science Report, and it was a serious documentary series, why would they sabotage their own careers? Just to prove that the public is gullible, number one, and number two, to pull a prank because they're tired of the dryness of docudrama series. Think about that. Some of these reasonings behind the alleged hoax don't stand up to scrutiny. And even though it was presented in the form of fiction and as a hoax, according to the producer, he says there are some bits of fact mixed in there. And that's always the case. This is how disinformation works. So was this deliberate disinformation just to implant these ideas into the greater culture? I don't know. I don't have the answers. But this is one of the most legendary facets of a secret space program. Let's continue reading and see what else Dr. Farrell can tell us about this. The documentary's inconsistent acting is mirrored in the book's incongruous slurry of wildly unconnected data, all served up as corroboration of the secret space program and its nefarious activities. And here's a quote from the book, and I do actually have this book somewhere in my vast digital archive. I have gone through the pains of reading it, and it is kind of wild and doesn't really give you anything legitimate to go with. Just more circumstantial evidence of things that may or may not relate to a secret space program, but it's so poorly put together that you can't really make heads or tails out of any of it. So it leaves you with more questions than answers, and is an obvious piece of disinformation. But let's read the quote here from the book here. Quote, "The death of 15 wild ponies in Dartmoor, England, is mentioned in an episode reminiscent of the cattle mutilations prevalent in the U.S. beginning in the mid-1960s. Factual CIA MK-Ultra mind control atrocities are also mulled over, but not in particular detail and with no credible link to Alternative 3. Along the way, instances of Russian-American cooperation in space are described, and we are offered accounts of the plights of several amnesia victims. But none of this has much to do with the core of the Alternative 3 thesis." Okay. So Dr. Farrell goes on to say here, at the end of it all, a book and a documentary, what does one make of Alternative 3? Jim Keith also wrote upon this, and he summarizes the whole episode this way. Now, this is from Jim Keith, another researcher I highly respect, who passed away back in the late 1990s under some suspicious circumstances, and he wrote an awful lot of things exposing much of the hidden agendas of this world. And he says, quote, excuse me, quote, "In summary, Alternative 3 is a teleplay and a book which utterly lacks substantiation, and the book in particular is written in a style identical to the Weekly World News of two-headed space alien gives birth to Elvis, love child fame. What propels Alternative 3 along in the manner of a 1940s amazing stories extravaganza set in the vicinity of Fleet Street are the secret documents, the interviews with persons who do not exist, and more than that, the word of the authors who, while repeatedly maintaining we are only interested in facts, write a television show and book loaded with as many questionable conclusions as the latest Brad Steiger UFO masterpiece. All the references to flights to Mars, batch consignments, and so forth are found in the poorly rendered and unbelievable secret transcripts or created from thin Martian air by the authors." End quote. But as Jim Keith himself notes, one comes away from viewing the documentary and or reading the book with an uneasy feeling, notwithstanding their clear and evident nature as hoaxes. And that uneasy feeling is that Alternative 3 and its various themes are quite close to the truth. That something like the odd goings-on in the documentary actually are occurring. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. That's the unsettling thing about this. It's the circumstantial evidence to point to this notion of this Alternative 3 secret space program. Maybe there is something like this going on, and I do believe there are some in the greater realms of conspiracy culture, if you want to call it that here, who have talked about this secret space program and these different Alternative 3 ideas. People like Laura Eisenhower, who a lot of people respect in this community, have talked about this. I don't know the truthfulness of all of this or where these people get their information or sources of information from or what their personal exposure to this may or may not have been. I don't claim to know any of that, and I'm not about speaking ill of anybody. But Dr. Farrell is correct here. It leaves you with an unsettled feeling. Because some of this is feasible, and it would seem that there is circumstantial evidence to point to something like this going on. So even though the whole production of this Alternative 3 Science Report episode and the book and everything associated with it seems to be deliberate disinformation or hoax, perhaps just for the purposes of making money. I don't know. I don't think the authors and producers of the show made a massive fortune on this. I don't think so at all. So I don't think that's the motivation, but there could be a disinformation motivation. Maybe there was connection to intelligence groups or some such thing to disseminate a lot of this, to keep people confused and lead them off the trail. But yes, it seems that it is unsettling and that things like this may actually be occurring. So Dr. Farrell continues and he says, in fact, Leslie Watkins, who co-authored the book version with the documentary's producers for Penguin Books, wrote a researcher who had contacted the Penguin editor that the book was, quote, based on fact, but uses that fact as a launch pad for a high dive into fiction, end quote. And a little later in his letter, Watkins recounts the unusual events that befall him after the book version was published and in circulation. Quote, for some time after Alternative 3 was originally published, I have reason to suppose that my home telephone was being tapped, and my contacts who were experienced in such matters were convinced that certain intelligence agencies considered that I probably knew too much. So summing up, the book is fiction based on fact, but I now feel that I inadvertently got very close to a secret truth, end quote. But if Watkins, Miles, and Ambrose had come too close to a secret truth that would call forth electronic wiretapping in response, what exactly in the crazy quilt work of the Alternative 3 universe was it? The universe of Alternative 3 is clear enough. There is a secret space program involving both Russians and Americans in cooperation, being controlled by some entity that transcends their governments and uses them for its own ends, which is the secret colonization of the Moon and Mars. To this end, it persuades or kidnaps scientists and commoners for manual labor. Those it cannot persuade or who threaten to expose the project are murdered. So one has the following elements. Number 1, several missing scientists in great numbers. Number 2, murdered scientists. Number 3, several missing common people. Number 4, a secret space program existing inside of or parallel to the public programs in Russia and America. Number 5, colonies on the moon and or Mars. And finally, number 6, some entity coordinating all of the above. So we have all of these interesting elements involved here, and I'm sure we've heard some connections to these elements before. So let's continue on. Conspiracy researcher Jim Keith investigated these aspects of the case and came to a rather provocative conclusion. A conclusion so provocative, in fact, that he seldom states it directly, though much of his book, Mind Control and UFOs, Casebook on Alternative 3, implies this conclusion simply by virtue of the amount of time he spends exploring it. We begin with point number 2 above, the deaths of scientists. Keith, like many other authors, noted the very strange fact that many European scientists, physicists, and engineers who were involved with or otherwise might have something to contribute to President Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative seemed to have unusually high suicide or death by mysterious circumstances rates. And oddly, most of these scientists were from Western Europe. Proportionally fewer Americans, Canadians, or Australians were involved in the unusual deaths. Among those that Keith lists were Keith Bowden, supercomputer expert, Roger Hill, a designer for Marconi Defense Systems, who allegedly killed himself by shotgun blast, Jonathan Walsh, digital communications expert for Marconi's parent firm, GEC, Karl-Heinz Beckertz, director of research for Germany's Siemens company, and his driver, and notes Keith, quote, an SDI contractor allegedly linked to activities of Otto Skorzny's Nazi International, end quote. Vimal Dabadji, an expert in computer guidance systems. Gerald von Braunmühl, a high advisor to West Germany's defense minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher. Ashad Sharif, another Marconi employee. A Swedish professor, Svante Odin, an Italian electronics executive, Lando Conti. Atar Singh Gita, an SDI technology expert, Richard Pugh, British Defense Ministry contracts worker, John Britton, computer expert, Swedish arms inspector Cal Frederick Algernon, and on Keith's list goes. Gonna pause for a moment. So this sounds like a lot of high-level scientists who have died under mysterious circumstances, doesn't it? Connected with these programs. So this presents circumstantial evidence to suggest that something similar to this may be going on, doesn't it? Let's continue on. So, like the mysterious deaths of key witnesses and personnel that followed the assassination of President Kennedy, rather, too many scientists and engineers were dying in too many suspicious ways for the whole episode to be entirely coincidental. Jim Keith also observes that, quote, in July of 1986, Kurt Rebman, Germany's federal prosecutor, told the New York Times that he believed the attacks were part of a coordinated offensive against the West and the SDI program. So, who killed the Star Wars scientists? In at least 2 of the cases, those of Beckertz and von Braunmühl, the Marxist Red Army faction claimed responsibility. In Italy, a note was found at the location of Grigeri's murder, stating that he was, quote, struck down exclusively for his responsibility exercised following the Italian adhesion to the Star Wars project, end quote, and attributing the murder to the Italian Red Brigades. Of course, notes can easily be faked, and the fact that responsibility was claimed in only 3 cases is odd if 2 groups performed all the murders, and that's the end of the quote from Jim Keith. One explanation, the obvious one, is that it was apparent to the Kremlin that SDI, far from being the defense program that it was touted to be by Ronald Reagan, had an awesome offensive capability. This much is true, as we shall see in Part 2, but in any case, Keith's conclusion is rational. The most obvious perpetrators of the strange deaths were the Soviets, who hoped to dissuade the West from deploying SDI. But according to Keith, there was likewise another possibility, and Keith says here, quote, It has also occurred to me that if there is in fact a secret flying disc technology on this planet, withheld for its surprise strike capability from some unknown quarter, then SDI might have been seen as a technology capable of pinpointing and shooting down such craft, end quote. That is, if there was an independent group perfecting such advanced craft, then that group too would view SDI as a threat and seek to derail it, or conversely seek to acquire and deploy its technologies while denying them to its enemies. It is this possibility that informs the bulk of Keith's book. Tracing the possibilities to a pre-war network of American and Nazi business contacts, he quickly comes to one locus of possibilities: the surrender of Germany's Foreign Armies East section of military intelligence to the OSS, a deal that was negotiated between General Reinhard Gehlen and OSS station chief in Zurich, Allen Dulles, later chief of the CIA and member of the Warren Commission. But the surrender was only apparent, as many have pointed out. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So, along with all of this, we have ties back to the intelligence community, to the CIA, to the Office of Strategic Services that predated them and brought into their fold the German intelligence and military apparatus under the leadership of Reinhard Gehlen. Interesting connections here for certain. And it is very much speculated that Germany was working on advanced space technologies at the end of the war. And we do know Operation Paperclip is a real deal thing. An admitted historical fact. And the same thing went on within the auspices of the intelligence community first, before the scientists from Operation Paperclip were brought into the U.S., and the Soviets had a similar program as well, to work on some of the same things they were working on under the Nazi regime. So now we get to Keith's summary, Jim Keith's summary about this. Quote, "For reasons that will hopefully become apparent, I begin the search for Alternative 3 at what might appear to be an arbitrary moment in history, with men, most of whom died a long time ago. As we trace the actions and connections of these men, the conspiratorial web will radiate outward and perhaps begin to take on a definite and ominous pattern. The study is taken up shortly after the collapse of the Third Reich, when General Reinhard Gehlen, Nazi spy master and Knight of Malta, there you go, folks, began negotiations with Allen Dulles and the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. Using Nazi intelligence networks as a whole card to provide for his own survival and the survival of his huge spy network, Gehlen made a separate peace with Dulles, resulting in the clean grafting of Nazi spy apparatus to the American clandestine services. This was the birth of the CIA and part of a nexus of betrayal that continues to this day. Indeed, as many others have pointed out, at the inception of the CIA, the agency's Soviet desk, for all intents and purposes, consisted almost entirely and exclusively of the Nazi spy network." Gehlen's own words recalling this bargain are clinically chilling, and here they are. Quote, "I remember the terms of the agreement well. Number 1. A clandestine German intelligence organization was to be set up using the existing potential to continue information gathering in the East, just as we had doing before. The basis for this was our common interest in a defense against communism. Number 2. This German organization was to work not for or under the Americans, but jointly with the Americans. Number 3. The organization would operate exclusively under German leadership, which would receive its directives and assignments from the Americans until a new government was established in Germany. Number 4. The organization was to be financed by the Americans with funds which were not to be part of the occupation costs, and in return the organization would supply all its intelligence reports to the Americans. Number 5. As soon as a sovereign German government was established, the government should decide whether the organization should continue to function or not, but that until such time, the care and control, later referred to as the trusteeship of the organization, would remain in American hands. And number 6, should the organization at any time find itself in a position where the American and German interests diverged, it was accepted that the organization would consider the interests of Germany first. End quote from Reinhard Gehlen. So Dr. Farrell continues here, and he says, in other words, one whole department of the American federal government, indeed one of its most sensitive departments, was being run by agents of the Third Reich in a classic Trojan horse operation. With the thousands of agents in Gehlen's organization and its extensive network of emigre exile groups and fronts, historian Carl Oglesby noted that the Gehlen-Norg substantially preempted the CIA's civilian character before it was ever born. Thus, whatever the CIA was from the standpoint of law, it remained from the standpoint of practical intelligence collection a front for a house of Nazi spies. End quote. The CIA, folks, is what many would refer to as the Fourth Reich. The intelligence apparatus in place, this worldwide intelligence apparatus that encompasses the CIA, the MI6, the Mossad, the Kremlin, all of these intelligence agencies, they fall under one particular blanket of control. And this was all done through these secret treaties at the end of World War II. And the German intelligence apparatus underlies that. And this is what many people would refer to as the Fourth Reich, the breakaway civilization. This is one of the tools of control that are established by this breakaway civilization. It's the use of the intelligence agencies, and they are interconnected. And how so, you might ask? Well, you could ask Reinhard Gehlen, a Knight of Malta. It's through the secret society groups. Where do you think the intelligence community gets its operating principles from? The secret society groups, and many within the intelligence community establishment belong to one of these secret society groups or another, and they're all interconnected, and they're all sworn brothers. They've taken blood oaths to help one another when in distress, and to uphold the secrets of the secret society group. And they operate in capacities of semi-officialdom within the intelligence community. And this is a type of a branch of the military-industrial complex when it gets down to it. It supersedes national sovereignties. It extends beyond the bounds of what we would accept as normal conglomerations of people groups. Let's put it that way. Nation states. It supersedes nation states. It supersedes all of this. It's a type of breakaway civilization unto itself. And it interconnects throughout the corporate world, throughout government and quasi-government world. It's an interesting type of an apparatus here. And there's this connection back to Nazi Germany that many don't talk about. You have to wonder about these things, folks. Let's continue on here. The importance of these observations cannot be pondered too long, for as many other researchers and commentators have noted, there appears to be a rogue element operating somewhere inside the U.S. federal government and inside its intelligence community. Jim Keith's observations and similar ones made by others who have researched the incredible bargain struck between Allen Dulles and General Gellin give a historical background and foundation to these fears. There not only is a rogue element within the American intelligence community, but it has been there since the end of World War II, and it was Nazi in its personal aims and methods. Moreover, as Jim Keith also points out, the Dulles family itself had long business associations with Germany, and there was an ideological connection, quote, "With man, as with every other form of life, there is this same tendency for the birth rate to far exceed the death rate, which the inevitable result of an overcrowded population in which some must be eliminated. Who those eliminated are depends upon who are the weakest and who are the strongest in the competition which necessarily ensues," end quote. So I'm going to pause right there. So the underlying inherent inference being made here is eugenics. Alternative 3. This very notion has connections to the Nazi intelligence apparatus, to the American intelligence apparatus, to the ideologies that permeate them that have to do with eugenics. We all know the outcome of World War II and what's historically accepted, and how this was a black eye on the eugenics program instituted therein. But the eugenics program has continued forward, folks. It didn't end there. It's still going on today, and it's gone from a passive phase into an active phase over the course of the past 4 years now, and we are witnessing in real time the utilization of this eugenics program by this intelligence apparatus and by this breakaway civilization, by those with a vested interest in depopulating this world. That is the ideological connection here. Now, Dr. Farrell continues and says, "If that sounds vaguely like an anti-Jewish rant of Hitler at the Nuremberg Party rally, think again. The words are those of Allen Dulles' brother, John Foster Dulles, who would later become the American Secretary of State under President Dwight Eisenhower. In any case, Gellin's bargain with Dulles was but one aspect of the creation of a vast post-war Nazi international, an organization with massive amounts of money, and, as has been seen, its own intelligence network. Maintaining close ties to each other and other escaped Nazis, this network evolved into what has been termed the Nazi International, run by Otto Skorzeny and headquartered in Madrid. The Nazi International would be key in the establishment of worldwide arms, terrorist, and drug trafficking networks, although these crimes pale in comparison with the subversion of American intelligence in collaboration with Allen Dulles, the results of which may be said to have been the creation of the Cold War and the continuing destruction of democracy in America. Skorzeny most likely was a front man for other more high-ranking Nazis, since he was the son-in-law to former Reichsbank President Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. But if Nazi penetration of America's post-war intelligence and national security apparatus was a Trojan horse operation under the banner of a united front against communism, what of the dispersal of Nazi scientists and technology? Could the notorious Operation Paperclip, America's secret post-war program to recruit top Nazi scientists and engineers, have also been viewed, at least on the German side, as a similar operation? Well, the evidence is scanty. It is nonetheless provocative. It begins with America's High Commissioner in Germany in the immediate post-war period, John J. McCloy. When Werner von Braun refused to work for the American space program without his former Army boss, General Walter Dornberger, who had in the meantime been sentenced by the war crimes tribunals to be hung, it was McCloy who stepped in and granted Dornberger a full pardon. In fact, McCloy pardoned over 70,000 Nazis accused of war crimes. Perhaps this is not surprising, since McCloy was a lawyer in the employ of I.G. Farben after World War I and had shared a box with Hitler himself during the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. And last but not least, McCloy, like Allen Dulles, also served on the Warren Commission. Once in the U.S., the Nazi scientists were, of course, watched closely, but not, it seems, too closely. As Jim Keith notes, quote, Walter Jessel, an interrogator of the German rocket scientists for the Army, claimed that there was a conspiracy between von Braun, Dornberger, and Dornberger's chief of staff to withhold information from U.S. officers, end quote. Given the fact that von Braun's rockets successfully became the backbone of America's space program up to and including the Apollo moon rockets, as well as became the backbone for America's intercontinental ballistic missiles, an important question thus occurs. What possibly could von Braun and Dornberger have been withholding? They may have been withholding technical information, since this was not an isolated instance, as the following incident indicates. 3 other German scientists brought to the USA were found to have illegal mail drops in El Paso, Texas, where they received money and coded messages from foreign sources. Other instances of Nazi scientists receiving money from unknown sources were not investigated by the military, including an instance when 1/3 of the German paperclip group simultaneously bought expensive cars that they were reportedly unable to afford on their salaries. There were also repeated suspicions that rockets were being sabotaged and that components were missing from recovered missiles. Gonna pause for a moment. So now we're beginning to see some real concerning facts regarding these secret space programs. Were they really space programs at all, folks? I would have to ask. And what space are we talking about? Is it simply the space between your ears? Let's read on here. So we have all of this going on in the post-World War II period with Operation Paperclip. So it says, if so, then the Gelenorg offered the perfect means to spirit any developed technology out of America and into the right hands. Jim Keith concludes his scenario with the following observations. Quote, the controlling reins of German technologies, such as rockets, advanced aircraft, and atomics, were never fully surrendered. Inner circle control, through knowledge obtainable only in the inner circle, was retained by Nazis and their sympathizers. It is in this environment of extensive collaboration and infiltration by Nazis and fascists, a collaboration that involves a long-term continuance of Nazi goals separated from earlier German territorial goals, and an overall shepherding and betrayal by international moneyed interests, government, and intelligence agencies, that America's descent into totalitarianism, genocide, and mind control becomes understandable, and the alternative 3 template becomes first visible. Gonna pause for a moment there. That's the end of the quote from Jim Keith. So alternative 3, was this a revelation of the method? Or was there something legitimate to it? Let's read on. So, Dr. Farrell concludes here, and he says, Keith's scenario is clear enough, and it is the same one in broad outline adopted here. Namely, number 1, that with the dispersal of Nazi technology, scientists and engineers into post-war Allied, Soviet, and possibly into covert and independent research programs more directly under control, and number 2, that with this grafting of Gellen's organization with its extensive espionage network inside the Iron Curtain into American intelligence, a powerful clandestine organization was created, an organization with international reach, ambitions, and finance behind it. Only such an organization could attempt to maintain two space programs, one for public consumption and another entirely off the books to further the interests, agenda, and power of the elite that controlled it. Only such an organization could attempt to coordinate the otherwise independent public space programs of the two superpowers. Seen in this light, it is easier to see why there was such a heavy Nazi presence in the web of relationships involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, for with his threat to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, he was taking deliberate aim at one of the power structures for this international rogue element to ensure its continued survival and the survival of its projects and agenda. Kennedy had to go. So that's the end of the portion that we're going to cover here about Alternative 3. And you see how Alternative 3 connects to everything from Nazis to the Kennedy assassination to the SDI program of the late 1980s from the Reagan administration and all the way across the board. So we have this notion of a secret space program, and what's behind this secret space program? Well, it would seem it's an intelligence apparatus, and was the dissemination of this Alternative 3 a bit of disinformation with a little bit of legitimate information mixed in? What's the true nature of this, and what is the ultimate goal of this? Well, certainly we see facets of truth presented in the Alternative 3 scenario. It would seem there is this breakaway civilization, this secret government behind the scenes that's international in scope, that seems to transcend all national sovereignties and borders and has its own agendas. And maybe they have developed space programs to set up off-world encampments for themselves. I don't know. I don't have the answers to that. Or maybe it's just to funnel monies for other things, and we know they've built underground bunkers and these things, so we've explored these concepts of Alternative 1 and 2 before, and we see this Alternative 3 as being a viable option, but maybe they have other alternatives as well. Because you see, overall, here's what they believe the big problem is: overpopulation. So maybe they did develop this Alternative 3 strategy, and maybe they discovered they can't go anywhere, and so they had to come up with another alternative for that. And perhaps this alternative is to do something to depopulate the world, and maybe we're seeing that unfolding before our eyes. I don't have the answers. That is mere speculation on my part. But we can see there are true elements involved in this Alternative 3 scenario, and that there have been and continue to be what are known as secret space programs. Now, what those monies actually go towards is anybody's guess, but I do realize and regard that they have developed secret technologies within the auspices of this program, and they keep this hidden away from the public. And it's very hard to get anything factual about this. So this Alternative 3 scenario, although it appears to be largely fictional at this point, it is admitted to be a hoax, but it seems to be a bit of disinformation with some underlying core truths behind it. So we need to keep it in our consideration and understand there do exist secret space programs. Now, what they do with the funding, do they really go to space, or are they talking about something different? Is it a code word for something else? Are there hidden agendas that have nothing to do with space, but they figure this is the best way to lead the public off the trail, looking at things like space programs and Mars landings and moon landings, when in fact they're funneling the monies to something else, perhaps biological research to depopulate the world in which we live. Like I said, speculation. I don't have the answers. But what we can know at the end of the day is this legend of Alternative 3 does have some impetus, in fact, behind it, even though it is largely disinformation. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today, folks. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you, and we'll catch you next time. Have a good one now. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit, except no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.